The barracks smelled of sweat, leather, and gun oil, the usual perfume of exhausted soldiers unwinding after a day of relentless drills. Boots clattered against the wooden floor, cards slapped against the table where a group played poker, and laughter rolled through the air as stories of bravado filled the room. The door creaked open, and silence briefly followed as a figure stepped in. She walked with quiet purpose, back straight, chin high, every inch of her uniform crisp and precise. But it wasn't her discipline that drew the stares. It was the jagged scar stretching down her right forearm, stark against her otherwise flawless appearance. Some eyes looked with respect, others curiosity, and one with cruelty. Private Collins, a brash recruit with more arrogance than experience, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Well, well," he drawled, loud enough for the room to hear. "Look who just walked in, battle scars and all. Tell me, Sergeant, did you get that peeling potatoes in the mess hall?" A ripple of laughter followed, though half-hearted, uncertain. Most soldiers knew better than to mock scars. Scars meant survival. Scars meant stories. But Collins was new, too eager to assert himself, too blind to see the weight behind silence. The young woman didn't flinch. She didn't glare, didn't scowl, didn't even acknowledge the insult. Instead, she kept walking, her boots steady against the floorboards. She set her gear down by her bunk and calmly began unfastening the strap of her rifle. Her movements fluid and deliberate. Her silence was louder than any insult. Still, Collins pressed on, mistaking restraint for weakness. "No comeback? What's wrong? Did the cat scratch your arm, or were you just clumsy?" His grin widened as if he'd won some invisible contest. The air grew tense. Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. They knew Collins had crossed a line. Mocking another's scars wasn't just tasteless. It was disrespect of the highest order. But before anyone could speak, the heavy double doors swung open. Boots pounded against the floor with sharp precision, and the atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations died, chairs straightened, and every soldier snapped to attention. General Marcus Kane had entered the room. Broad-shouldered, silver-haired, his presence carried the weight of decades in the field. His eyes scanned the barracks like floodlights, catching every detail, every posture, every sign of discipline, or the lack of it. The silence was deafening. Collins stiffened, his smirk vanishing as he scrambled to stand upright. The young woman, calm as ever, stood already at attention, her scarred arm at her side, her gaze steady and unflinching. The general's boots clicked against the floor as he approached. He stopped in front of her, his eyes not on the scar, but on the soldier herself. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a voice deep and resonant, the general spoke a single word. Her call sign. Phoenix. The effect was instant. A collective shiver passed through the barracks. Phoenix. The name wasn't just a call sign. It was legend. Every soldier had heard the stories whispered in the field. The mission gone wrong in hostile territory, the ambush that had left most of the team pinned down, the explosion that should have killed her. But Phoenix had risen from the flames, dragging her wounded brothers out one by one, holding the line until reinforcements arrived. Her scar wasn't from weakness, it was from survival. From sacrifice. Collins' face paled as the truth sank in. The scar he had mocked was the very mark of courage he could never dream of earning. His chest rose and fell rapidly as realization clawed at him, his arrogance shrinking to nothing under the weight of silence. General Kane's gaze flicked to him, sharp and unforgiving. "Private," he said coldly, "when you've lived through half of what Sergeant Phoenix has endured, then, and only then, will you have the right to speak." The room remained silent. Collins swallowed hard, his throat dry, his pride shattered. The general turned back to Phoenix, his tone shifting, softer now, but still filled with command. "Carry on, Sergeant. You've already said more with silence than others do with words." She nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, then returned to her bunk with the same calm composure she had entered with. But the barracks was no longer filled with laughter. Now it was filled with respect and Collins. once smug and mocking, stood frozen, the weight of her call sign echoing in his mind, a reminder that scars were not marks of shame, but proof of survival. The barracks at Fort Ironwood were alive with noise. The day's drills had ended hours ago, but soldiers were still buzzing with leftover energy, swapping stories, cracking jokes, and blowing off steam before lights out. Poker cards slapped against the tables, dice rattled in cups, and laughter echoed off the steel rafters. Into this chaos walked Sergeant Elena Ward. She moved with quiet precision, every step measured, her uniform pressed as if she had just come from inspection. She wasn't flashy, didn't bark for attention like some others, but as always, she drew eyes, not because of her posture, not because of her discipline, because of the scar. It stretched across her right forearm, a jagged reminder of some violent encounter, pale against her sun-browned skin. Most of the veterans in the room had learned better than to ask. A scar that deep wasn't from training mishaps or kitchen accidents. It was combat, the kind that left you marked forever. But Private Collins didn't know better. Or maybe he just didn't care. He was new, fresh from basic, with the arrogance of someone who hadn't yet tasted failure. Collins leaned back in his chair, boots crossed on the table, and smirked when he saw her. His buddies glanced at him nervously, but he was already speaking. "Well, look at that," he said loudly, making sure the room heard. "Sergeant Ward, or should I say, Scarface?" "What happened, Ward? Slip while peeling potatoes?" A few chuckles broke out, though muted. Not everyone found it funny, but nobody wanted to be the first to shut him down. Elena's expression didn't flicker. She kept walking, boots steady against the wooden planks, her focus entirely on her bunk. She placed her gear down neatly, her silence absolute. Collins wasn't satisfied. He leaned forward, voice dripping with mockery. "Or maybe you just got clumsy? Heard you used to trip during PT. Guess the rumor was true." Now the room was truly tense. A few soldiers shifted in their chairs, uneasy. Everyone could feel the disrespect hanging in the air like smoke, but Elena? Still no reaction. She unfastened her rifle strap, laid the weapon across her bunk, and began cleaning it, each motion smooth, deliberate, and calm. Silence as a weapon. But Collins mistook it for weakness. His grin widened, and he opened his mouth again. The double doors slammed open. The sound cracked like thunder, and every soldier instinctively straightened. Boots pounded against the floor in sharp rhythm, the sound of authority incarnate. General Marcus Kane stepped inside, tall and broad, his silver hair cropped tight, his face weathered with years of battle. The air in the barracks shifted instantly. Conversations died. Poker games froze, dice hung forgotten. Collins leapt to his feet, his smirk vanishing as he stood stiff, scrambling to compose himself. General Kane's gaze swept across the room, sharp and assessing. It paused on Elena, then shifted briefly to Collins, before returning to her again. He stopped walking. The silence deepened. Soldiers held their breath. Then, in a voice that rumbled with command and carried the weight of memory, the general spoke a single word. Phoenix. It was Elena's call sign. The effect was immediate. Every soldier who had heard the whispers, the legend, straightened further. Phoenix. The name carried with it a story of fire, blood, and survival. The scar Collins had mocked wasn't a weakness. It was proof she had walked through flames that would have killed others. And emerged alive. Collins went pale. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, the arrogance bleeding out of him. He had mocked a veteran, a survivor, a soldier whose name was spoken with respect even by generals. General Kane's eyes locked on him, cold and sharp. "Private," he said, his tone like steel. "When you've earned half of what Sergeant Phoenix has given this uniform, then you may speak. Until then," his voice dropped, deadly quiet, "you'll hold your tongue." Collins stiffened, nodding quickly, his face burning with shame. The general turned back to Elena. "Carry on, Sergeant. Your silence speaks louder than their noise ever could." Elena gave a crisp nod, then resumed cleaning her rifle. Calm, steady, unshaken. The barracks was no longer filled with laughter. Now it was filled with respect. And Collins? He would never forget the weight of a single call sign. The name Phoenix wasn't given lightly. It had been born in smoke and blood, on a night no one in Elena Ward's old unit would ever forget. 2 years earlier, she had been deployed with her Special Forces team deep in hostile territory. The mission was simple on paper: extract an informant, secure intelligence, and retreat before the enemy caught wind of their presence. But missions that look simple in briefing rooms rarely stay that way once boots hit the ground. The team had been ambushed. Gunfire tore through the narrow streets of the ruined city. Bullets ricocheted off crumbling walls, tracer fire streaking across the night like falling stars. Elena sprinted alongside her brothers in arms, returning fire, her pulse steady despite the chaos. Then the explosion hit. A roadside IED, hidden beneath rubble, detonated just as her squad reached the intersection. The world became fire. Heat, shrapnel, and shockwaves slammed into her, hurling her across the pavement. The night filled with screams, some from her team, others cut short far too soon. When the dust cleared, Elena's arm was shredded with metal, blood pouring down her sleeve. Her ears rang, vision blurred. She could have stayed down. She could have passed out. But through the haze, she saw them. 3 of her men pinned under collapsed debris, 1 more bleeding heavily, and enemy fighters closing in. Something in her snapped, or maybe ignited. Pain became background noise. She pushed herself up, ignoring the blood dripping from her arm. Grabbing her rifle, she laid down suppressive fire, forcing the enemy to scatter back into alleys. Then, with her good arm, she clawed at the rubble, pinning her comrades. Her muscles screamed, skin tearing against jagged stone, but she kept pulling until 1 soldier was freed. "Go," she barked, her voice raw but commanding. "Get him out!" The freed soldier dragged the wounded man toward cover, while Elena turned back, refusing to leave the others behind. She heaved again, her body trembling under the weight. Shrapnel dug deeper into her arm, hot blood running down to her fingers. But she didn't stop. When another fighter appeared at the end of the street, aiming his weapon, Elena swung her rifle up with her injured arm and fired. The shot dropped him instantly. By the time reinforcements arrived, she had pulled all 3 trapped men to safety, her own body close to collapse. She was barely conscious when the medevac helicopter lifted off, the battlefield fading beneath them. Doctors later told her she should have lost the arm. Infection, torn muscle, embedded shrapnel. It was a miracle she could even move it. But somehow, she had fought through the pain long enough to save every man who'd been trapped. Her commanding officer gave her the call sign Phoenix, because she had risen from fire and ruin, not just alive, but carrying others with her. The scar was all that remained of that night, etched into her skin as proof. To Elena, it wasn't shame. It was survival. It was sacrifice. It was a reminder that when everything burned, she had not only endured, she had led. Back in the present, in the barracks at Fort Ironwood, none of this needed retelling. The whispers of Phoenix's legend had traveled through units, across bases, even into classrooms where new recruits studied real-world courage. Everyone knew pieces of the story, enough to hold her name with respect, everyone except Collins. Until tonight. Now, as the weight of her call sign settled in, he understood. The scar he mocked wasn't ugly. It was a badge, carved by fire, worn by someone who had earned her place 100 times over, and he would never make that mistake again. The barracks was silent, so silent that the ticking of the old wall clock felt deafening. Collins stood frozen in shame, his face drained of all color, while Elena, Phoenix, continued calmly cleaning her rifle, as if the general's words had changed nothing. But they had. Every soldier in the room felt the weight of the moment pressing on them like armor. They weren't just witnesses to a rebuke. They were witnesses to a truth. General Marcus Kane paced slowly across the barracks floor, his boots echoing with measured authority. His eyes swept the room, sharp, unrelenting, before landing squarely on Collins. "Private Collins," he said, voice steady but cutting. "What you see as scars, we see as survival. What you tried to turn into a joke is the reason men are alive today." Collins swallowed, his throat dry. "Yes, sir," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Speak up, soldier. Kane barked, his tone cracking like a whip. "Yes, sir." Collins answered louder this time, his voice trembling. The general stopped pacing. He stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes narrowing as he addressed not just Collins, but everyone. Every scar on a soldier's body tells a story, not of weakness, but of battles fought, of pain endured, of lives saved. And if you think mockery is the response, then you don't belong in this uniform. The words hit the room like a hammer. Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably, reminded of their own scars, physical or invisible. A few lowered their eyes, ashamed of having chuckled at Collins's insult earlier. Kane wasn't finished. He turned toward Elena. She looked up briefly, her expression calm, then returned her gaze to the weapon in her hands, the very picture of discipline. Kane's voice softened, but it carried deeper. "This soldier," he said, motioning to her, "is Sergeant Ward, but you know her by her call sign, Phoenix. That call sign wasn't handed out like candy. It was earned, in fire, in blood, in sacrifice. While many would have fallen, she rose. And she carried others with her." Elena didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was confirmation enough. The general pivoted back to Collins, his voice now cold steel. "Do you know what it takes to pull a wounded comrade out of rubble while bleeding yourself? Do you know what it takes to keep firing while your arm is shredded with shrapnel? Do you know what it takes, Private, to choose your brother's lives over your own?" Collins shook his head, his voice cracking. "No, sir." "Then learn," Kane snapped. "Learn from the ones who've done it. Learn to respect the men and women who've already proven themselves in fire before you even set foot on your first battlefield. Because one day, if you're lucky, someone like Phoenix will be the reason you get to come home." The silence in the room deepened. No one dared move. No one dared breathe too loudly. Finally, General Kane straightened, his voice carrying finality. "This is your lesson, soldiers. Respect isn't about rank. It isn't about loud voices or bravado. Respect is about sacrifice. And Sergeant Phoenix has sacrificed more than you can begin to imagine. If you can't honor that, then take off the uniform and walk out that door." Nobody moved. Kane's eyes lingered on Collins one last time. "Consider yourself lucky, Private. Lucky that Sergeant Phoenix values silence over pride. If she had chosen to answer your words tonight, you wouldn't have liked the lesson." Collins' face burned red. He lowered his head, shame washing over him. The general turned sharply on his heel. "Carry on." With that, he left the barracks, his boots striking the floor in perfect rhythm. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, heads turned toward Elena. She remained at her bunk, rifle in hand, calm and unshaken, as if the storm had passed right over her. And in that silence, her legend only grew. That night, the barracks was quieter than usual. Conversations resumed in low tones, but the rowdy energy had vanished. Some soldiers still stole glances at Elena, but no one dared make a comment. Her call sign had spoken louder than any defense she could have offered. Private Collins sat on his bunk, staring at the floor. His earlier arrogance had drained away, leaving a hollow pit in his chest. The general's words replayed in his mind over and over. "If you're lucky, someone like Phoenix will be the reason you get to come home." Collins clenched his fists. He hadn't meant to humiliate her, at least not in the way it had turned out. He thought it had been harmless banter, a way to get a laugh, to fit in. But now he saw the truth. He hadn't been making a joke. He'd been mocking sacrifice, mocking survival, and that cut deeper than he expected. He looked across the barracks. Elena sat at her bunk, her scarred arm glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights as she reassembled her rifle with quiet precision. She didn't look angry. She didn't look smug. She looked steady, like nothing anyone said could move her. That steadiness only made Collins feel smaller. The next morning, during drills, Collins couldn't shake the shame. His steps faltered. His timing was off, and his normally cocky swagger had vanished. Sergeant Miller barked at him twice for falling behind, but Collins barely heard. His mind was still stuck in the barracks, hearing the general's voice thunder across the room. When the unit broke for water, one of the other privates muttered, "Tough night, huh?" Collins forced a half smile, but it died quickly. He couldn't laugh it off anymore. He realized something important. Respect in the military wasn't earned by jokes, bravado, or showing off. It was earned by sacrifice, discipline, and courage, and Phoenix embodied all three. Later that afternoon, while others cleaned weapons or wrote letters home, Collins found himself standing awkwardly near Elena's bunk. She glanced up, her eyes calm but unreadable, and then returned to her work. He cleared his throat. "Sergeant, He stopped, words choking in his throat. He had never apologized in uniform before. To him, apologies had always felt like weakness. But now, not saying it felt worse. Elena kept cleaning her weapon, waiting. "I was out of line," Collins finally said, his voice low. "Last night. I disrespected you. Your scars. What they mean. And I get it now. I was wrong." For a long moment, she said nothing. Collins felt his chest tighten, bracing for silence, maybe even contempt. But then Elena set her rifle down and looked at him fully. Her gaze wasn't harsh. It wasn't forgiving either. It was steady, assessing him the same way she would an uncertain recruit on the firing line. "Collins," she said quietly, "scars aren't weaknesses. They're proof you kept moving when the world tried to stop you. You'd do well to remember that. For yourself, and for anyone you fight beside." He nodded quickly, relief washing through him. "Yes, Sergeant." Elena gave the faintest nod in return and picked up her weapon again. The conversation was over, but to Collins, it meant more than a lecture or punishment ever could. That night, as he lay on his bunk, Collins replayed her words in his head. Proof you kept moving when the world tried to stop you. For the first time since enlisting, he stopped thinking about how to look strong and started thinking about how to become strong. The road ahead would be long. But Collins knew one thing with certainty. He would never look at scars the same way again. And Sergeant Phoenix? She had just become the standard he wanted to live up to. 2 weeks later, the unit was deployed for a field training exercise in the dense woods outside the base. It wasn't war, but it was designed to feel like it. Long marches, ambush drills, and night maneuvers that pushed everyone to their limits. Private Collins strapped on his gear with determination. Ever since the barracks incident, he'd been working harder, keeping his head down, trying to learn instead of show off. But this was his chance to prove it. Not just to the others, but to himself. Elena, Sergeant Phoenix, was leading one of the squads. Collins found himself under her command again, a twist of fate that made his pulse quicken. The first day went smoothly enough. They trekked through mud and thorns, moving as one unit, Elena's calm voice guiding them through every formation. She never raised her voice, but when she spoke, everyone listened. By the second day, fatigue was setting in. They had been given orders to simulate an assault on a hilltop position defended by another squad. Collins was near the front when the enemy squad opened fire with blanks, smoke grenades filling the air. Down. "Spread out!" Elena barked, her tone sharp but controlled. Collins dropped, heart hammering, his cheek pressed into the damp earth. He peeked out through the haze. His squadmates were pinned. The only way forward was to flank, but it meant crawling through thick brush under fire. Elena started giving orders. "Mendez, flank left! Harper, suppress fire!" She moved with purpose, her scarred arm lifting and signaling as if the chaos around her didn't exist. Collins hesitated for a second, then forced himself to move. He belly-crawled through the brush, branches tearing at his uniform. Every instinct screamed at him to duck, to stay hidden, but he remembered her words. Scars are proof you kept moving when the world tried to stop you. So he kept moving. Halfway through, one of his squadmates stumbled and froze, too rattled to keep advancing. Without thinking, Collins doubled back, grabbed the soldier by the vest and muttered, "Come on, you're not staying here." The soldier's eyes widened, but he followed. Together they crawled forward until they reached a ridge where they could get a clear line on the enemy. Collins raised his training rifle, squeezing bursts of blanks toward the opposing squad. His fire, combined with the others, allowed Elena to push the team forward. Within minutes, they stormed the hilltop and secured the position. "Exercise complete," the evaluator called out. The squad let out exhausted cheers, collapsing into the grass. Collins was gasping for air, mud streaking his face, but a fierce pride burned in his chest. For once, it wasn't about proving he was the loudest or toughest. It was about not quitting, about helping his squad win together. Later, as the squad regrouped, Elena approached Collins. He stiffened, bracing for critique. Instead, she gave a short nod. "You didn't freeze," she said simply. Collins swallowed hard. "I just remembered what you said, Sergeant." Her expression softened just slightly. That's how soldiers earn respect. Not with words, but with choices under pressure. Today you chose right. It wasn't praise. Not exactly, but it was acknowledgement. And coming from her, it meant more than applause from a crowd. Collins stood taller, shoulders squaring. For the first time since joining the military, he felt like he might truly belong. That night, as they camped under the stars, Collins glanced at Phoenix across the fire. She wasn't looking at him, but he didn't need her to. He knew he was on the right path, and if he kept going, maybe, just maybe, one day he'd earn a call sign of his own. The training exercise wrapped after 3 grueling days in the field. Exhausted soldiers marched back toward base, boots caked in mud, eyes bleary but proud. For many, it had been the toughest challenge of their young careers. For Collins, it had been something more, a turning point. Back at the parade ground, the entire company assembled. Helmets tucked under their arms, they stood at attention as the commanding general arrived. The same general who, weeks earlier, had silenced the barracks with one word: Phoenix. He paced in front of the line, his eyes scanning the faces. Then he stopped in front of Elena. "Sergeant Phoenix," he said, his voice booming. "Your squad performed with precision and grit. You led them through chaos without hesitation. That's why you carry the scars you do. Not as marks of weakness, but as proof of survival and leadership." Elena nodded once, her expression steady. She didn't need to smile. The respect in the general's tone was acknowledgement enough. Then the general's gaze shifted. It landed squarely on Private Collins. Collins stiffened, heart pounding. "I'm told," the general continued, "that this private showed initiative during the exercise. He didn't freeze under pressure. He kept moving. And more importantly, he made sure no man was left behind." A murmur rippled through the formation. Collins's jaw tightened, but inside his chest swelled. The general's tone softened slightly. "That's the mark of a soldier learning what this uniform truly means." For a moment, Collins thought he might actually grin, but he held firm at attention. After dismissal, soldiers gathered in small groups, replaying the highlights of the exercise. Collins found himself the subject of a few nods, the kind he used to crave, but now they felt different. Earned, not forced. He turned to see Phoenix approaching. She stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, her scarred arm catching the afternoon light. "You did good out there," she said. Collins swallowed. "Thank you, Sergeant. That means a lot." She studied him for a long moment, then added, "Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you live. You started to understand that out there. Don't stop now." Her words weren't flowery, but they hit harder than any metal could. "Yes, Sergeant," he replied firmly. For the first time, she allowed the smallest curve of a smile. Then she walked past him, moving to debrief with the others. That night, Collins sat on his bunk, staring at his hands. Weeks ago, those same hands had pointed and mocked. Now they had pulled a teammate through the mud, kept firing when it mattered, and earned acknowledgement from both a sergeant and a general. He realized something else, too. Scars weren't just physical. They could be memories, failures, or lessons carved into your soul. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to earn his own. Across the room, Phoenix polished her boots, calm as always. Collins felt a flicker of gratitude he couldn't quite put into words. She hadn't just put him in his place that night in the barracks. She'd set him on a different path, a path toward becoming the kind of soldier worth following. Weeks later, during another briefing, the general introduced Collins by name. But then, with a faint grin, he added something that made Collins's chest tighten. "Private Collins is starting to earn a call sign of his own." He hasn't got one yet, but he's proving every day that he just might deserve it. Laughter and applause rippled through the room. Collins didn't laugh. He only nodded once, his resolve solidifying. Phoenix caught his eye, gave the barest nod in return, and that was enough, because respect wasn't a gift. It was a battle, and this time, Collins was ready to keep fighting for it.